Doom is an interesting franchise to talk about, not because of its obviously rich history that saw the original single-handedly transform the entire game industry, but for its ability to evolve and drastically change its core gameplay with each new entry. We've seen it in Doom 3, Doom 2016, Eternal, and now here in the Dark Ages, with each entry proving that this legendary franchise not only has staying power, but can successfully pivot between fundamentally different styles of gameplay from one entry to the next. It's clear that id is not content with simply building upon what works, rather focused on trying to innovate not only their own prestigious IP, but the genre as a whole. This is commendable, and I think they deserve a lot of praise for willingly taking such big risks in a flooded market that often plays it safe, delivering more of the same year after year. In this light, I think The Dark Ages is another success for the franchise. It is yet again a fundamentally different experience than its predecessor, but still a highly polished game that's unmistakably Doom. This makes it easy to praise and recommend to people. I think it's a real crowd pleaser, but things get more complicated depending on who you're talking to. When Doom 2016 released and brought the series into the modern age, there were plenty of longtime fans that found it disappointing, maybe from abandoning the horror atmosphere of Doom 3 or disliking the locked in an arena loop throughout the game. Then came Eternal, that cranked every dial of 2016 up to 11, with its complex combat that demanded more from the player than perhaps any other game in the genre. So with the series that changes as drastically as Doom, it's easy to understand why some fans may love one and dislike another. You may dislike Eternal for its overwhelming mechanics, while simultaneously appreciating just how finely tuned it was despite its complexity. I think all this is important to keep in mind when watching reviews on the Dark Ages, trying to decide whether it's for you or not. To me, Doom 2016 and Eternal were masterpieces in their own ways. I love them both, the latter of which being one of my favorite FPS games of all time because of its impressive replay value thanks to its incredible combat sandbox. Now, after beating the Dark Ages and reflecting on my time with it, I genuinely wish I could say that the team at id pulled off the hat trick of 3 masterpieces in a single trilogy, but that just isn't the case here, unfortunately. I personally found the Dark Ages to be a downgrade in every sense of the word, in every area of the game besides the graphics. The whole experience felt like this huge, unnecessary course correction from the criticisms they received on Eternal. But more baffling to me is how they made some of the same mistakes anyways, making the complete gutting of Eternal's excellent combat loop feel even more offensive and unnecessary. Where Eternal was this finely tuned, escalating symphony of complex destruction, the Dark Ages is this clunky one-trick pony that shows its entire hand at about the 5-hour mark of its 15 to 20-hour campaign, leaving very little room for the combat to evolve past throwing everything at the player in tight spaces. So while this is undeniably a highly polished and complete game that most will enjoy, I can't help but feel now that it's live on Game Pass and more players got their hands on it, it'll find itself going down as the most divisive Doom title to date, rivaling even Doom 3. I'd quickly like to mention that my entire time within the Dark Ages was with the game speed set to 150% on Nightmare difficulty with the parry window set to small, but more on all that later. Speaking on performance, this game runs fantastic and looks great all the way through. Granted, I played in 2K on an RTX 5070 Ti with all settings max, DLSS set to DLAA with frame generation ×2. I've no doubt that it's still a highly optimized game for much lower end hardware so long as you're willing to drop some settings. This is just what id does. The Doom games always showcase their latest id Tech engine capabilities with high polish, and the Dark Ages is certainly no exception, showing us that id Tech 8 is a real powerhouse. I didn't encounter any major bugs, crashes, or even slowdowns during the latter half of the game's huge firefights. I did have to switch from DLAA to quality in the final few chapters, only because I was streaming and recording all footage, and the fights were starting to affect encoding. Otherwise, it would have been perfectly fine all the way through. Make no mistake, this is a beautiful game. Models look great with high fidelity, and the level of detail in its wide open environments is certainly an achievement.
We will not leave here until the heart of Argent is found.
The Dark Ages is a prequel expanding upon the deep lore that Eternal was mostly implying, set in the distant past before even Doom 2016. The Sentinels are fighting off a demon invasion, and so they call upon their gods, the Makers, who have the Doomslayer brainwashed and tethered to their will, to deploy him for aid, a weapon of mass destruction against the demons. Now, if all this is sounding incredibly silly, it's only because it is. Doom 2016 began slowly planting the seeds of this sillier side of the lore in the second half of its campaign, but mostly maintained a lot of the mystery that kept the Doomslayer as a badass with a vague past. That mystique surrounding him is important. I think the character works best the less we know, and I really started to feel that in Doom Eternal, as even despite my overwhelming love for the game, I greatly disliked how they expanded upon the lore, slowly lifting the veil on what is otherwise an interesting character so long as we're filling in the blanks ourselves. Still, it wasn't pushed too much to the front, and was otherwise a non-issue, easy to ignore, and hey, who's really playing these for a thought-provoking story in the first place, right? The Dark Ages, on the other hand, is hell-bent on absolutely assaulting you with its narrative, taking itself far too seriously while trying to explain and build upon ideas that were only ever alluded to before. While you may be sitting there saying, dude, just ignore it, or who cares, it's a Doom game. I mean, I agree, but there's just so much of it here that while it was easy to brush aside in the previous two entries, it becomes an actual detriment to the game this time around. I'm not going to get into any spoilers beyond what I've already set up, which was just the intro to the game anyways, but the story here is so generic and full of every trope we've seen thousands of times over again. What's even worse is by explaining a lot of this, they're actively making me dislike the narrative as a whole across the trilogy, doing damage to its predecessors. Several times during the many lengthy cutscenes, I couldn't help but feel like I was watching a bad comic book movie, like a really bad one. Like a Sony Spider-Man spin-off movie bad. Tell me this fucking guy doesn't fit right into something like Morbius.
The time is now. Avoid the Slayer. We should focus on breaking the humans first.
The line delivery, the writing, the tropes, it's all just so egregious and comes across as a 13-year-old's fanfiction at times. It's really hard to look the other way and focus solely on the gameplay when what you're presenting here is so painful to sit through and you're taking it as seriously as you are. Luckily, despite all that, I still don't really care about the narrative. At the end of the day, I just want some good Doom gameplay, and that's where the Dark Ages can still deliver. While I have a much more nuanced take on the combat loop here than most, make no mistake, this game is fun, and combat is definitely satisfying, with the tight gunplay you've come to expect from id. Every weapon feels powerful, with clear use cases, and looks great as they're ripping and tearing through waves of demons. Of course, there's also the addition of the shield, which adds a whole new and unexpected layer to the mix. Obviously, it can be raised to outright block attacks, used to charge into the fray, thrown at enemies like your Captain Doomslayer, and to parry some attacks. Combined with some excellent audio and visual design that makes every action feel impactful, this all ends up feeling like a really fresh and unique combat loop, especially since id have repeatedly said they've focused on returning to the roots of the franchise with the stand and fight philosophy. What this all equates to is a big emphasis on heavy, grounded combat. You're not jumping around swinging on monkey bars, dashing around to the nearest launch pad, or frantically running away in search of a health pickup. Instead, it's clear right from the start that you're meant to bring the fight to them, using your shield to charge directly into close quarters combat, parrying their melee attacks while distant enemies cast a net of bullet hell towards you, finish the staggered demon off with your mace, weave through the projectiles in search of that one that can be parried and deflected back to its attacker, and start the loop over again. It's very active and visceral, but not overwhelming. There's not much of a mental stack to keep track of here. You right click on the green glowy bits, press E on the purple dudes, and weave in between the red sparklies until the arena is clear. In the opening I mentioned that this game felt like a clunky one-trick pony, and so I guess it's time for that rug pull. The combat really does not ever evolve past the simple loop I laid out before you, which is on full display less than 5 hours into the game. Sure, there's plenty of new weapons and enemies being thrown into the mix, but unlike Doom Eternal, there's just no real variety to any of it. It all plays the same, right down to the repetitive combat arena design that mostly amounts to either wide open spaces with little cover or claustrophobic close quarters boxes. It's also incredibly slow, painfully slow for my taste, and if they didn't include the option to crank up the game speed to 150%, I wouldn't have enjoyed it nearly half as much as I did. I do think the team tried their best to stretch this framework as far as they could, with the returning branching weapon upgrades and upgradable rune systems which can affect how you play, like a shotgun firing incendiary rounds so demons drop armor, or your parry casting magical daggers like you're playing Elden Ring. There's some fun ideas here. It's just a shame that everything else feels so homogenized in the guise of giving players more options during combat. A common complaint against Doom Eternal was being forced into certain weapon types and strategies for dealing with specific demons. By the end of the game, you were expected to juggle like 6 different cooldowns alongside constantly swapping your weapons to optimally deal with the priority targets. Not to mention, the whole time you're supposed to be running circles around the entire arena like you're some sort of Sonic the Hedgehog from hell. It was a lot to keep track of, a big mental stack that required a high APM, so I can totally understand why it didn't click with some players. But in id's desire to address this one criticism, they completely gutted all the complexity and depth from the combat in the Dark Ages. So much so that I actively disagree with the notion that there's more player choice here. Granted, I was playing on Nightmare and you definitely start with a higher ammo capacity than in Doom Eternal, but you're still pigeonholed into dealing with specific demons in optimal ways. It's always best to break armor with a chain shot that follow up with headshots from the Impaler. The super shotgun is always the obvious follow-up to a shield charge, regardless of the target. Rows of shielded foes require either a plasma weapon to pop or a ballistic weapon to heat up and prime for a shield throw, which then pops the entire row. Don't get me wrong, I like the interplay here, but we're literally still forced to swap constantly if we're trying to play optimally, only this time around everything is far slower, including switching weapons. So if it's still the same, then what am I complaining about? Well, it's the complete lack of meaningful options from one encounter to the next. The arenas themselves provide very little in the ways of variety. There's next to no verticality, no interesting layouts of monkey bars, launch pads, and warp gates to utilize. This alone makes each fight feel nearly identical to the last. I honestly couldn't even single out and tell you about any specific encounter I thought was memorable. The enemy compositions also don't feel as finely tuned as they were in Eternal. I can't tell if it's a lack of playtesting, or rather the combat is just too simple to present any actual variety to the player, though I suspect it's the latter. To me, it's very clear even id was aware of this in the second half of the game, where they started resorting to locking you into laughably small spaces, throwing everything at you back to back, including spawning new waves of enemies behind the player constantly. I'd wager that this is also the real reason why we have such a suite of difficulty options, like being able to increase the game speed, alter the parry window timing, increase projectile speed, or player damage. Without these, the game would have even less replay value. It's also easy, like really easy. Even with my difficulty settings turned up, I didn't encounter too many tough battles. Any difficulty was down to learning the new spawn compositions or a new attack pattern. The question then becomes, why would id do this? Why the overcompensation for criticism directed at a highly successful game? The answer, I think, lies in the shield. This fucking shield that's the core central mechanic through the entire game. Amidst the bullet hell that's slowly encroaching upon you at all times are some attacks you can parry and deflect back to your attacker, often staggering them and triggering your shield's rune ability, which, as I mentioned, can cast magical daggers, activate your auto turret, or the very overpowered smite that stuns all nearby demons. All melee enemies also have several telegraphed attacks that can be parried. Some even have full-blown combos that will eventually stagger them for big damage or glory strike. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire game was clearly built around this one central mechanic, and it's far worse for it. It makes me question what the hell it even means when they talk about returning to Doom's roots. I guess I just missed the entry where you stood still waiting to parry attacks like you're playing Sekiro or something. Listen, I like parry mechanics, I like bullet hells, but what the actual fuck is this doing in a Doom game? No, it isn't bad, it's actually quite fun for a couple of hours, but it's also so shallow and never evolves past waiting for the green glowy bits to parry until it's your turn to attack. In fact, during several of the later game encounters, I was overthinking how to approach enemy compositions by frantically running around, swapping weapons, and looking for weaknesses to exploit. Instead, the optimal play was to shield charge face to face with the enemy and stand still waiting to parry attacks. They really embraced their stand and fight design philosophy. It just isn't fun after a while, despite being technically solid and by no means an outright bad design. There's absolutely nothing new on offer after the 5-hour mark. You've seen it all and will continue to go through the same motions until the credits roll, including some of the most disappointing boss fights I've experienced in a while. that boil down to the same stand and fight nonsense. The biggest irony in all of this is they stripped away Doom Eternal's complexity in favor of a more universal and accessible mechanic that I'm certain will not click with everyone. If people hated the Marauder in Eternal, then I'm genuinely curious how they're going to respond to enemies like the Agadon Hunter or the new Cyber Demon, where a similar design philosophy is still present. Only now you're expected to also enjoy parry and stagger systems, something I know the average player doesn't. I haven't even mentioned that the glory kill system was removed in favor of striking an enemy with your mace. I get that it's to keep the pace of the new combat loop, but it only adds to the repetitive nature of the game. All of the strike animations look a bit silly and lack the raw power we've come to expect the Doomslayer being capable of. Actually, they kind of reminded me of Avowed, which is not a game I wish to be reminded of. With the more grounded approach to level design, the breaks in combat took a hit as well, with light puzzles being little more than a 10-second distraction. Maps are also larger and non-linear this time around, so a good portion of downtime is spent in the map menu looking for secrets and running to the next encounter. To help break up standard combat further are these giant mech and dragon sections. Hell, even a couple of turret sections like we're playing Duke Nukem Forever or something. Look, I gotta be honest. The giant mech and dragon sections are fucking terrible, and the game would be much better off without them. The mech is little more than a button mashing minigame, while the dragon is basically a somehow worse version of the Batmobile from Arkham Knight. Everyone loved that, right? No, I didn't find them badass. No, they weren't fun sections to play through, and no, their inclusion in the story didn't elevate it in the slightest. I can't imagine the player that finishes one of these sections and thinks to themselves, oh hell yeah, I can't wait to replay that. Actually, I don't even want to meet those players. You do you, buddy. Now go finish your applesauce. Finally, what ties all of this together? What's been stuck in our heads since the first Doom graced us 32 years ago? Some iconic badass music, of course. A good soundtrack is a core feature in this franchise and is absolutely a requirement at this point. Mick Gordon is a hell of an act to follow, and I don't envy anyone that's had to try. At this point, I've already dropped a whole video's worth of hot takes, so what's one more, right? I found the music here to be painfully generic. In fact, all it did was aid in making the entire game feel repetitive. First off, the audio mix is way off, so I had to crank the music up in the options just to hear it properly, and once I did, I was graced with the same, 3 power chords for 15 hours straight? There is very little variety to the tracks, with many of them just kind of droning on and on, almost like these guys don't even want to be there. It really reminded me of some garage metal. You know the dudes in your high school that had a moderately successful side project, or those backyard gigs you'd go to every weekend when you were young. I can hear the money behind the production, but ultimately it's just generic metal 101 to me, with very little hooks or hype moments that get the adrenaline pumping. The way the music ebbs and flows between combat and exploration is also handled significantly worse here than in the previous 2 games, especially when encountering a new enemy type. It contributes very little to the experience. I'm not trying to say it can only be Mick Gordon on this franchise, though I certainly wouldn't mind that. But this soundtrack just completely misses the mark for me. Towards the end of the game, I was also noticing some tracks that didn't sound like they were mastered properly, especially some of the final songs that would jarringly transition between each other. These guys clearly have the skills to produce good music, so I'm gonna have to place the blame on id here. Maybe they got the Mick Gordon treatment of having little to no thematic direction for the majority of the project, and had to bang this thing out on an unrealistic schedule, while being gaslit that their work wasn't matching the team's vision. Hope those guys at least got paid for this without having to work on 2 more Bethesda projects first. Stay classy, Marty. Let's see, what else is there? Oh yeah, there's no multiplayer component this time around, which, I don't know. I put a good chunk of time into both Doom 2016's and Eternal's multiplayer. Though neither were particularly deep, they were still fun side activities that only added more value to already excellent games. So on the one hand, I don't really care that it's absent here, since I don't wish to play any more of this game. But on the other, it is less product for more money, a product that I personally feel already suffers from a major lack of replay value, so it's up to you to decide if this bothers you or not. Frankly, I don't understand why we haven't gotten a simple horde mode yet. Let's just team up with some Doom bros and decimate waves of demons together like a Killing Floor clone or something. Space Marine 2 just showed us that a simple throwback multiplayer mode can still be a good time. The framework is already here, so why not put some development time into it? Tell you what, let's stop with the silly ass narrative you keep insisting to expand upon and put that money into a competent multiplayer mode instead. Before I close out this review, I want to share some thoughts I had towards the end of the game, especially during the Cosmic Realm sections, which we already saw in promo material that spoiled Cthulhu, who's also a major letdown by the way, but I think this game should have been a Quake reboot in the same way Doom 2016 was. Granted, I don't immediately think of parrying and bullet hell gameplay when I think of Quake, but they could have positioned this as a solid Quake reboot with minor retooling. Lean harder into and focus solely on the Eldritch stuff, which feels a little out of place here anyways, and really hone in on the darker universe that is Quake. After all, this whole game feels a bit like a spin-off of Doom as it is, so why not bring back another beloved franchise from the dead? No, instead we have Doom: The Dark Ages, a game that's by no means bad despite my heavy criticisms of it, but also one that absolutely fails to live up to its predecessor's legacies, forced into their tall shadows as the inferior experience simply through direct comparison. Were this not Doom, it wouldn't have to shoulder such a burden, but it is, so here we are. Look, I definitely had enough fun with it to justify a playthrough, and can generally recommend it to most people, but I also don't really think it's worth its asking price due to how quickly it becomes repetitive and lacks any sort of replay value. It's a one and done kind of game. This isn't Doom Eternal that's still on your hard drive because you go back to remind the demons you're the only one they fear every few weeks. There just isn't enough depth here for that, and I suspect there's going to be a whole new segment of players that dislike the unavoidable emphasis on timing parries, even if they also disliked Eternal's combat. It really felt like an overcompensated course correction that alienated Doom Eternal fans, such as myself, while managing to present a new combat framework that may still not even appeal to those players they're hoping to recapture. Doom: The Dark Ages is certainly not worth its asking price, but it may be worth an eventual playthrough if you're interested in what it has to offer. If you have the Game Pass, then it's a no-brainer. Definitely give it a try. If nothing else, it's a fun 20-hour distraction. Otherwise, rent the game or wait for it to hit the bargain bins, because in my eyes, this is easily the worst of the new trilogy, and it's a shame to close out such an impressive run with such an underwhelming disappointment. I really wanted to like Doom: The Dark Ages more than I did, but I have to keep it real. This was a downgrade in every sense of the word.